Hello friends and welcome back. Today we're starting a new reading vlog. Today we are going to try and get to the books that I DNF'd during my recent reading slump. If you're new here, welcome. It's nice to have you. Back in like late February, I had a mental health crisis due to like issues surrounding my hand injury. And I was really struggling for a few months there. I'm doing okay now and I am getting back into reading. But at the beginning of that reading slump, there were 3 books that I tried to push through and just couldn't quite manage it. But I don't want these books to go languishing on my shelf for too long, so I thought it would be nice if we sit down together and we try to make our way through the rest of these books. Because obviously they're books that I was interested in, and I am still interested in them. I want to read them. Let me introduce you to the books quickly, and then we're going to get straight into the reading. The first book I soft DNF'd was Song of Silver, Flame Like Night by Amelie Zhao. This is a young adult fantasy that came out early in the year, and I was really looking forward to it. Obviously, this absolutely beautiful cover is what sold me immediately, but I also have a colleague at work at the children's bookshop who said that I just had to give this a go. She thought I would love it. I think I started reading this like mid-February, so I gave it a good go before my inevitable decline. I got up to chapter 5, page 58. And I honestly don't remember a lot of the details. Hopefully they'll start to come back to me as I get back into it. But what I do remember is that I wasn't like in love with it yet, but I was enjoying it. And I was definitely curious to see what happened next. So I think for this one, I am going to start from the beginning, at least kind of like skim over what happened and just see how much I remember. But 58 pages starting over, that's not too bad. A book I tried to read right at the end of February was The Hate Race by Maxine Beneba Clarke. This was voted for the March book club book for my Blossom book club over on my Patreon. This is a memoir of one of my favorite Australian authors, so I was so excited to finally be getting to this. But as beautiful as Maxine's writing is, and as much as I love her, a lot of this story is about race in Australia, and the prologue in particular hit pretty hard. It's only short, but pretty quickly I realized I wasn't quite up to investing in this right then. Basically, I knew this is the sort of book that I want to be emotionally available for. As I said, I adore Maxine, and I think anybody's story is worth being open and spending the time with, but especially when it's somebody that you appreciate and respect so much. I didn't want to half-ass reading this book, you know? So I think I put this down at like page 6 or 7. I knew pretty quickly that I wasn't up to it. So we will just be starting this over from scratch. And every single Maxine book I've ever read, I've read in like a day or 2. So I feel like it's going to be a pretty quick read for me, and I'm really looking forward to it. Then if you were following along with my vlogs that I was putting up while I was kind of struggling a little bit, I did pick up a book that I thought I would try and read. I think it was back in like March or April. And surprisingly, I did manage to get all the way up to page 62. I just didn't manage to finish it. That was Wrong Place, Wrong Time by Gillian McAllister. I was really enjoying this. I'd heard really good things about this book from Mara from Books Like Woe and Meg from Meg with Books. This is a murder mystery with a little bit of a timey-wimey twist. And basically we're introduced to a mother who is waiting up for her like older teenage son to come home late at night, when she spots him out on the street and witnesses her son stab somebody. And she's obviously just in absolute shock, but she goes to bed that evening and then wakes up, but it's the day before the murder happened. And so basically I think she continues to go back a day at a time, and essentially we might kind of learn why her son would do something like this. I was surprised actually that I managed to read as much of this as I did, but I remember it just being so readable. I feel like this is the kind of book that I could binge in a day or 2, when I'm at my normal reading capacity anyway. So I feel like with this one I do remember a little bit more about like the macro plot, but I probably don't remember a lot of the details. So I think I'll go back to the beginning and maybe just kind of skim over and see how I'm feeling, and then make the decision as to whether to dive back in at page 63 or just to start from scratch properly. Anyway, those are the 3 books that we're going to be reading together in this video. Pretty wide range. We've got a timey-wimey murder mystery, a powerful memoir by one of my favorite authors, and a young adult fantasy. It's quite the mix, and I'm so excited to get started. Let's dive right in. So I have just finished Wrong Place, Wrong Time, our first book for this video, and how am I feeling about it? I have to say that this didn't go quite as I was expecting. I was genuinely expecting to absolutely love this book. I think partly just because I'd heard people like Meg and Mara talk about it with such enthusiasm. And then also, to be perfectly honest, the first time that I read this, and when I got to like 60 pages the first time, I was having a really good time with it too. In this book, we're following our main character, Jen, who's kind of like a middle-aged woman. She's a lawyer living in England. She lives with her husband, Kelly, and her son. Her son has just recently turned 18, and he's always been a pretty good kid. He's a very smart kid, and he hasn't really gotten into too much trouble during his teen years. However, in the very first chapter, we meet Jen when she's waiting up for her son, just before Halloween. She's waiting for him to come home, and he's a bit late, and she's getting worried. And then she spots him. She sees him walking home in their street, but she knows that something is not quite right. So she heads outside and she witnesses somebody kind of come up behind her son and her son turn and stab this man, like square in the belly. This is a kid who's never really gotten into too much trouble before. She didn't even know he had a knife, and now he's just killed somebody. Jen runs over to try and like put pressure on the wound and to stop the bleeding and to try and figure out what the hell her son has just done and why. But her son is just standing there being like, yeah, I did it and I had to do it. And even when the cops come, he's like, yep, I stabbed the guy, take me away, arrest me. And Jen, being a lawyer, is kind of just like, stop talking. And she wants to figure out what her son has done and why, like where he got the knife, like was this premeditated? Probably, the fact that he has a knife. But the cops tell Jen and Kelly that, you know, their son is 18, he's legally an adult, and he says that he doesn't want a lawyer. And so there's nothing more that they can do right now. And so they tell Jen and Kelly to just like go home, get some rest, and come back in the morning. And so that's what they do. But when Jen wakes up the next day, her son is at home. Her husband doesn't seem to think anything bad happened last night. And she kind of quickly realizes that it's actually the day before. So she's gone back in time. And essentially we watch as each chapter she wakes up on a different day. She just keeps going back further and further in time. And so she kind of comes up with this idea that she must be going back in order to like find out why her son did this and hopefully to find the answer to be able to stop him from doing it. So it's a really cool premise. It's quite fun and it's very pacey, easy to read. And there is just like a lot that unfolds as Jen kind of like relives her life in reverse. And essentially, you know, she's paying attention to things and noticing things that she didn't notice the first time round. Things like the fact that her son in the last few weeks, you know, he does seem a little bit more edgy and a little bit more concerned. He's lost a little bit of weight. Like something's not quite right. And even like the people that he's hanging out with, they're people that, you know, he didn't used to hang out with. And I don't want to give too much away because I feel like this is something if you are interested in, it is like a good fun read. And there's just a lot that unravels. I really enjoyed some of the themes that were brought up, especially like this idea that Jen gets in her head pretty quickly that it must have been because she wasn't a good enough mother. Like she didn't love her son enough. And maybe that's why he's done this. So at first she kind of thinks that this is an opportunity to like love him the right way and that will make it so that he never gets himself in this situation where he ends up murdering somebody. And so in a lot of ways this does kind of tackle the idea of like mother's guilt and parental guilt that a lot of women in particular, especially those who also want a career as well as a family, end up struggling with. So I liked that exploration a lot. And like I said, it was just kind of like a fun, easy read. But at the end of the day, I found myself losing interest as I continued. Even though the plot got more twisty and tangly and theoretically more interesting, I think I just wasn't too into the characters themselves. I didn't care about Kelly, the husband. I didn't really care too much for the son. I did a little bit. I cared a little bit about Jen, but I guess I wasn't as invested as I needed to be to get through a 350-page book and still care enough to be like totally in it. It's closer to 400 pages. And I think it did just feel a little bit long for what it was, at least for me. I don't know that I would go so far as to say it felt repetitive, but I did feel, especially towards like, you know, the halfway to 3/4 mark, I just don't think that we needed as much detail as we got. And to me, like the ending was pretty obvious as well. And so I guess like maybe if you didn't guess the ending, the payoff would have been a whole lot more like satisfying than it was for me. So yeah, I really enjoyed the first half and then the second half just kind of dragged on and overstayed its welcome a little bit with me. I will say that I wouldn't describe this as a sci-fi novel. I know I've heard some people kind of like question whether, you know, because it's got time travel that it's sci-fi. I think like the sci-fi angle isn't really explored that much. I mean, there's a couple of conversations about it, but primarily that is just like a plot device to create a mystery story told in a bit of a unique way. At the end of the day, this is a murder mystery. It just happens to be told in reverse. I was trying to think about whether I would still recommend this, and to be perfectly honest, I think the fact that I haven't read an awful lot within this genre, like I haven't read a lot of murder mysteries or mysteries in general, certainly not many thrillers, so I don't really have a good kind of like base point for what makes a good mystery or what makes a good thriller. And I don't even really know if this is a genre that is really for me. So I guess at the end of the day, all I can say is that it was a quick, pacey, fun enough read that I liked but didn't love, but your mileage may vary. Okay, we are back with our next read, Song of Silver, Flame Like Night. How am I going to talk about this book? To put it bluntly, I wish this had have stayed a DNF because I I didn't like it. Originally when I read this, I remember getting to page, I think it was like around 60 or 50-ish. So like not a huge amount in, but like, you know, like a good chunk of the introduction kind of thing. And I remember not being fully in it yet, but like not being mad at it. Like I was kind of like feeling pretty neutral. And I was a little bit intrigued to see where it went, but I suppose I wasn't invested yet. Like it didn't capture me straight away, but it also didn't repel me immediately either. And I suppose, to put it bluntly, it never did capture me. I was never invested. And in particular, once we were introduced to our like kind of male protagonist, Zen, that's when it kind of all took a very sharp turn down for me. Basically, I mean, this is a high fantasy story. I think it's going to be a duology. At the very least, like this is the first book in what is to be a series. And it is the very classic setup of orphan girl who doesn't know she's special, turns out to be like the chosen one, essentially. Which is totally fine, as long as your characters are strong and the world building is interesting and compelling. However, I would say that, at least for me, this book failed on both those fronts. Pretty much all of the characters in this are very driven by one thing. Like we know what their motivations are and they're very kind of like simple, straightforward motivations. There's some defining moment in everybody's past that has like defined their path forward. Everyone has a singular focus and very few characters deviate from that focus. I think I probably could have enjoyed the story, except for the fact that I don't think it was written very well and the way that the world building was done. Like it was 100% info dumping the entire time. And essentially that is what the character Zen is there for. He's there to be a romantic interest, but he's also there to just info dump everything our main character doesn't yet know about the world. And obviously we as the reader don't know either. So there is very little world building that happens organically. Instead, it's just like Zen filling us in on every little detail. And I found that absolutely exhausting. I didn't find it engaging. I didn't find it invoked a sense of atmosphere. I didn't find it interesting. I just felt like I was getting a lecture from Zen every other chapter. Also, and I don't quite know how to phrase this correctly, it was just more a feeling that I had. There was something off about even the plot and the focus. Essentially, without giving too much away, the magic of this world revolves around 4 demon gods that exist. There are also lesser demons that exist as well, and basically people can make bargains with these gods and demon gods to kind of like harness their power. And essentially a lot of this book is about invasion and colonization, and that is the primary conflict. We have an occupying force who have been there for quite a while who enact brutality and violence and oppression all over the land. And then we have the Hin, or the Han, I think it was, who are the native people who are being oppressed. And it is their connection to the demons and the demon gods that, like, you know, is the true magic of this land. But the occupying force have also kind of found a way to tap into that magic, and they've essentially like outlawed it for the native people. And they've done things like, you know, all of them have to have like a single syllable as their name rather than their complex exotic names. So there is like some commentary there on colonization and oppression, and the way that colonization so often not only like oppresses a people literally, but also by removing their culture and identity as well. Potentially powerful stuff, right? However, and I suppose this is kind of spoilers, and like I said, I don't really know how to pinpoint my issue with this book, or if maybe I'm just kind of missing something, but there was something off to me about how by the end, the way that the magic of our native Hin is framed is as if it is dangerous and bad. It almost feels like the justification that the occupying people have used to like oppress the Hin as like these savages who don't know how to control their magic is almost reinforced by the story. Like, did I miss something? Anyway, to be perfectly honest, I was skimming by the end, so I could very well have missed something, but there was just something that kind of felt a bit off in terms of the dynamics there and the way that the magic system was framed. And who knows, maybe that is explored in future books in the series, I don't know. And to be perfectly honest, I will never know because I will not be reading any sequels in this series. I did not enjoy it. I didn't enjoy the characters, they were very one note. I also didn't like how at the very beginning, we did have a female character besides our protagonist who did seem good, but like all of the other women and female characters that our main character interacts with end up being like backstabbing horrible people, which does read a little bit like Not Like Other Girls, you know? And again, I know that I don't always love YA fantasy, and so sometimes I get criticism from people saying that I just don't understand the genre. And I do appreciate that a lot of the time YA does tend to be a little bit more straightforward and simple in terms of its like conveying the world building and stuff. But I have still read plenty of YA fantasies that I have loved and that I feel like did achieve intrinsic world building. A really great example that comes to mind immediately is The Girl Who Fell Beneath the Sea. I'm sure there is some info dumping in that, but a lot of the world building is still done just through like observation and experience, and so it feels immersive in a way this book never did. Not once did I forget I was sitting on my couch reading a book, you know? Anyway, I don't want to shit on this book needlessly, and I'm not saying it's a terrible book. I'm really happy that it seems to have found an audience who love it. Unfortunately, however, that audience is not me. And so even though I had no desire to DNF it when I started it back in March, I kind of wish I had, and I had just left it because finishing this didn't offer me anything, and I will promptly forget that I ever read it. Here's hoping book number 3 is going to make this video worth my time. Over the years, I have read her essays, I've read her short stories, and of course I've read some, but not all yet, of her poetry. And on top of that, actually, I just remembered I've read a bunch of her children's books as well. And while her short story collection, which is the first work I ever encountered, remains my favorite to this day, I don't think I've ever not loved one of her books. On top of that, she's a local author. She lives in my area, my immediate area, and I've been lucky enough to attend 2 of her events and meet her in person. In fact, my copy of Foreign Soil is signed. She said, "Dear Katey, words change the world, Maxine Beneba Clarke." And I've got my copy of How Decent Folk Behave signed. She said, "Dear Katey, from my heart to yours, Maxine." So all of that to say is it any surprise that I really loved this book too? As I mentioned in the intro, this is Maxine's memoir, but it primarily, not exclusively, but primarily focuses on her youth and her experience growing up Black in Australia. We do learn a little bit about her family and where they come from and how they came to Australia. Her mom is an actress and her dad's an academic. And we do, especially in the prologue and right at the end of the book, we get a little bit of this nice bookend of adult Maxine looking back on this time and her experience. But primarily, as I said, this is a book about Maxine's story growing up in Australia as a Black person, but also kind of situated very solidly in middle-class suburbia. And we follow her from her younger years into primary school and through high school as well. I always enjoy Maxine's writing. I just find her, I don't know, very present. She always feels very close and just super engaging and easy to read. It's a very direct style, but still quite emotive. And ultimately, I just found it really powerful and moving and interesting as well. Some of this book is more about learning about her family history and her family dynamic, but a lot of it does also center around the violences, big and small, the macro and microaggressions that Maxine experiences, and how all of these things really affect her as a kid and her sense of self and her sense of safety. I think in particular, if you're Australian and you went through the Australian schooling system in the 80s or 90s, I mean, maybe even later, so much of this will be so familiar, but obviously me being a white person, just kind of witnessing the same sort of classes that I had, the same sort of lessons that I had, just from a Black child's eyes, was really, really powerful. For instance, the colonization of Australia and the story of Captain Cook discovering this empty land. That's a very small part of it, but I was taught that, and I kind of went through the schooling system a decade after Maxine, and the story I was told was not that much different. And that was something that I, as a white kid, totally accepted then and there. It was something I had to unlearn later in life. But for Maxine, her kind of already outsider's perspective does make her question this idea of some perfect utopia of a colonized land from much earlier on. She sees the way that people like her are taught and spoken about and represented, and she can identify with an element of that experience in the Aboriginal story as well. And so without really understanding it from a really young age, she has this sense of solidarity with the Aboriginal people. And essentially she kind of refuses internally to dehumanize them in the way that her school system is encouraging her to. And for example, her school was hosting a Colonial Day parade, and she says, I felt a kind of awe at knowing I was definitely on Black country, not my family's country of origin. I knew by then that my parents had been born in a distant part of the world, but all the same I felt the knowledge of it, of the certain blackness of the country I was born in and raised on. But then more personally, we also see examples of when Maxine's blackness is tokenized by the school system. We see examples of her trying to do the right thing and it never quite being good enough, and when she stands up for herself, she's seen as some aggressive, violent bully, despite the fact that she is the one who is being bullied and who is experiencing aggression. I think one of my favorite parts, to be honest, was the prologue. That's not to say that I didn't enjoy the rest of it, but like having adult Maxine kind of reflect on how race has shaped her and how it affects her as a mother. And then this one paragraph right at the end of the prologue, I just thought was so beautiful, with her kind of like thinking about where her spirit belongs. I carry proudly the burnished mahogany of my ancestors. Though my Africa is 4 continents, 400 years of slavery, 1 forced migration, 2 voluntary migrations, and many lifetimes ago. So long ago that when I die, the fierce fertile continent of my origin might refuse my spirit entry. My soul will be spirited south, sent packing back to Australia, the land of my birth, my country, my children's country, the only home we know. And I mean, those words are beautiful and powerful in and of themselves, but they just felt like such a beautiful summary of so much of what is explored in one of my favorite books of all time by Maxine, Foreign Soil. This book is a collection of short stories and it features different people, some in Australia, but many from all over the world, who essentially feel or are perceived as foreign in their location. Some of them are asylum seekers, some of them are housewives, some of them are second generation. Like, there's a big variety of experience here, but at the end of the day, all of them just feel in some way displaced and unwelcomed in the space that they're in. And I think that's such a powerful theme to explore, and I'm so glad she did it in a whole book, a whole collection of short stories, because as I said, it's my favorite. But the way she summed up that kind of, that feeling and that idea so succinctly and powerfully, I just wanted to share it. I think when I first picked this book up, because I picked it up quite a while ago, I was under the impression, I don't know why, that this did kind of like carry on into her adulthood in terms of the memoir, which honestly I was looking forward to. I was really looking forward to, because like I know that Maxine, like she kind of like rose to prominence as an author and as a writer a little bit later in life. You know, she kind of rose up through like the slam poetry scene in Melbourne. And that's something I don't know a lot about. I've just heard her kind of mention a couple of times in interviews, and I was hoping that we'd get a little bit more of that. But unfortunately, at least for now, I do not have access to that part of Maxine's story, and that's okay. I still found this incredibly powerful and just really, really readable. Some elements of it definitely are difficult, but there's something about Maxine's writing that like I always finish her books in a day. I don't think I've ever taken longer than a day to read one of her books. So at the end of the day, I am just so happy that I finally returned to this book, and I loved it just as much as I thought I would. So clearly The Hate Race was my favorite book of this video, like by far. Honestly, it's not even a competition. I am glad that I ended up going back and finishing Wrong Place, Wrong Time, if only because I feel like it would have been one of those books that I would always be curious about. Now I can check it off my list, and I can know at least fairly confidently that I don't think this kind of thing is really for me. That's not to say I'll never read another kind of like mystery thriller, but for the most part, they're not the kind of books that I want to be like filling my shelves with, you know? And then obviously the book that I wish I had DNF'd. Whether that was like just not picking it up again or like DNFing it at some point in this video is A Song of Silver Flame Like Night. A lot of times when I read these kinds of books, I might not personally enjoy them a lot, but I, as a bookseller, can kind of read them through the lens of like who this might be for, who I will happily recommend it to. And that's not to say I will never find a person to recommend this book to, but like at the end of the day, the struggle was real and like that was my primary experience. I would be hard pushed to find something to like genuinely compliment this book on, or to like highlight something that I feel like it did exceptionally well. In no way was this compelling to me. So I think I said in the intro of this video that we had a big mixed bag, and I meant in terms of like genre and audience and all of that sort of stuff, but like we literally have a mixed bag also in terms of enjoyment. I think it very unlikely that either of these two books will stay in my collection. This one though will happily live next to Maxine's essay collection and I'm sure over time I will continue to reference it and even reread it in future. But that is it. That's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed hanging out with me. Let me know in the comments down below if you have kind of like soft DNF'd any books that you feel like maybe it's time to return to. If the success rate of this video hasn't turned you off that idea entirely. As always, a big thank you to my wonderful patrons over on Patreon, and especially big thank you goes to Olivia, Lynette Brown, and Marie. Thanks for hanging out with me while I read these books. I will talk to you in the comments below and in the next video. Until then, happy reading. Bye!